Hello and welcome to Take Two with Jerry and Debbie. I'm Jerry Usher along with Debbie Georgiani. And the name of the program, Take Two, as it indicates, we look at pretty much every issue that you might deal with in your life at some point. And today we have a topic that for us personally, it's going to come about, but for our loved ones and others that we know, we might experience this multiple times during our lifetimes, and that is the question of how to treat the body of a deceased loved one or relative, or even ourselves when our day comes. We're going to talk about burial and cremation, and the church really has some pretty firm understandings and policies in regard to these things. And Debbie, we want our listeners to join us right now because so many of us have lost a loved one. My mother passed away 1.5 years ago, and we laid her to rest. And so, Debbie, these questions come up about burial, and some people think, well, it's more convenient to cremate, and then they want to have the cremains on the mantle at home or scatter them at sea or something. And the church really has some wise guidance on all of these issues.
The church definitely does. And in our families that are very diverse, we may have relatives that are non-Catholic and may have a different view of the burial when somebody dies, and cremation may be something of a whole different feeling, if you will. And so we want to talk about that because as Catholic Christians, we have a definite teaching on the respect for the human body when it has died, and in the burial process and what it means to be buried as a Catholic Christian. So today we're going to have an expert on with us, and that is great. But we want to hear from you, dear listeners. So if you are thinking about this or planning for this for the future, because eventually we're all gonna die, so we have to really think about this. If you're starting to think about this, or you have encountered this in your family, we want to hear from you. What was the thought process? What was the conversations happening? What did you finally decide? A traditional burial or a cremation? We want to hear from you. 1-800-585-9396.
All right, our guest is Dr. Carol Houghton. She is the chancellor for the Diocese of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and she has been on the tribunal. She's been there for 30 years. She's the defender of the bond on the tribunal, which really touches more upon annulment questions, but as a canon lawyer, she certainly has the pulse on issues such as burial and cremation as well, and she taught canon law at Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Emmitsburg, Maryland. Beautiful, beautiful campus. I've had the blessing of visiting there. Carol, welcome to Take Two with Jerry and Debbie. Thank you for making time to talk about this very sensitive topic.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
I think in preparing for the show, Carol, I think you mentioned, and Debbie just alluded to it, the place to start is really with a look at the dignity of the body. I mean, sometimes we can think, well, the person is more the soul than the body. So when somebody dies, the soul is gone, heaven, hell, wherever, but the body is just kind of this lump of whatever decaying. But we, as Catholic Christians, the church really looks at the body more profoundly than that.
Right. I think you're right, Jerry. The place to start this whole discussion is with the dignity of the human person. And the human person is a combination of body and soul. And as Christians, as Catholic Christians, we believe that death does not and cannot even rob us of our fundamental dignity as human persons. And we're confident in the resurrection, that just as we have imitated Christ in his death, we shall imitate him in his resurrection. And the church teaches very clearly and very strongly that we believe that our human bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, and that our bodies are destined for resurrection, and that it's our body that was washed in baptism, that was anointed with the oil of salvation, that was nourished with the Holy Eucharist. In baptism, and in confirmation, we were marked as priest, prophet, and king. And in this life, we took on the mission of Christ. Not only were we marked with his character as priest, prophet, and king, but we took on the mission of Christ in the world as priest, prophet, and king with our hands, with our feet, with our heart, with our mind. In other words, with our bodies. It's what we had in this life to bring Christ to others. And the Church's belief in the sacredness of the human body and in the resurrection of the dead finds expression in the care now at death to prepare the bodies of the deceased for burial. And we reverence and care for the body, for the human body. And that reverence and care grows out of a reverence and concern for the whole person, for the human person, for whom the Church now recommends to the care of God.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Carol Houghton, we have her with us. You are with us. You are the canon lawyer of the Diocese of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And you said that so beautifully. As you were speaking, I just had this very warm feeling of just realizing how beautiful the Church plans for and respects the body from, as we have heard it said, from the womb to the tomb. How wonderful is that? Dr. Houghton, I wanted to ask you real quickly, we've got a lot of calls coming in. Please keep calling and get on to talk to Matt Gabinski, our call screener. You'll be put on hold. You can hear the show. It's 1-800-585-9396. We're talking about burial and cremation. One thing I want to ask you, Dr. Houghton, about this idea of, we know that cost-wise, we know this, cost-wise, it's significantly cheaper to cremate a person that has passed on than to bury them traditionally. We know that.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So put that aside for one moment. We also know that there's this sentimental kind of secular movement happening right now where people are saying, well, my loved one really loved the ocean and wants to go back to the ocean, and my loved one wants to go to the highest mountain in the world and wants to be scattered off the highest mountain, and my loved one wanted to stay with me near and dear to my heart, and so I'm going to create this piece of jewelry and put some of the cremains in the jewelry. Where is that coming from? Because I have never in my lifetime heard that so much as I do now.
Right. Well, you brought up a couple of issues there. One is the scattering of these cremated remains, and the other is to preserve them in statuary or plates or jewelry where we can take some of those cremated remains and take them home with us and keep them preserved in some kind of jewelry or a plate or some remembrance like that. And I think that's coming from our society today in which the Church exists. And the reverence that I talked about earlier, the reverence for the dignity of the human body, the human person, in which we celebrate the sacraments and in which we see the human person exercising the mission of Christ in the world throughout his or her lifetime. That reverence isn't always shared by the society in which the Church lives. And we find a difference in approach to the human body itself, or in this particular case, to the remains of the human body after cremation. And I think it's more and more prevalent in today's society than it ever was, that distinction, that difference between what the Church teaches and what society now sees as an acceptable way of dealing with these cremated remains.
Take two with Jerry and Debbie. Our guest, Dr. Carol Houghton. She is Chancellor for the Diocese of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, also a canon lawyer. We're talking about burial versus cremation. If you've got a loved one who maybe has expressed their wishes that they're. I know I had a very good friend who, and I know his ashes were scattered at sea, and that's what he wanted. And he was not Catholic, but as Catholic Christians, we have certain guidelines and rules that the Church places, not to be a mean ogre type of mother, but because there is that dignity of the body even after death. So if you're preparing a loved one, or maybe making your own plans for whenever you might pass away at some point, hopefully, God willing, not anytime soon, and you have questions about this issue, it's 1-800-585-9396. Carol, quickly before we go to the break, kind of a two-part question. I guess, does the Church place a preference on burial over cremation whenever possible, and maybe give some instances on when cremation is maybe not only permissible, but perhaps even preferable?
Well, the Church certainly does place a preference on burial, and always has. And that practice of burial goes back to early Christian times. And I think for two main reasons. The first reason is that the practice of burying the bodies of the deceased in a grave or a tomb, or as time went on, in a mausoleum or a columbarium, is an imitation of the burial of Jesus himself. And so that's the first reason. And then secondly, it's an affirmation of the resurrection of the body. And so for those two reasons, the Church has always preferred the burial of the body of the deceased. Secondly, the Church currently, as you know, does not prohibit cremation except for one instance. If it's chosen for reasons contrary to Christian doctrine, then it's prohibited. And especially if it's chosen contrary to a belief in the resurrection, then it's to be prohibited. But that's the one time where the Church says, no, we're not opposed to cremation, but still the Church strongly recommends the pious custom of burying the bodies of the deceased for those two reasons I mentioned.
Dr. Houghton, we're going to get ready to take just a quick pause and come back to our phone calls that are coming in pretty fast, and this is going to be a great conversation. You're referring to the one line in the Catechism, I believe, where it says that faith in the denial of faith in the resurrection of the body. Is that correct? So if somebody actually expresses to the Church, I don't believe that's going to happen, and they have to actually verbalize it in order for the priest to say no, you can't. I mean, how does that? Where does that play in?
Yeah, I think it would have to be pretty clear, for something to be denied to the person, But if it's also in the Code of Canon Law, it'd be Canon 1176, paragraph 3. But it would have to be pretty clear that this person chose cremation as a statement against the Church.
Okay, gotcha.
Against the doctrine of the Church.
Right. So defiant, very defiant.
Yeah, and
right.
as you pointed out, there are reasons today that people choose cremation. One is cost. Another can be, if there's an infectious disease, and there's not time, you want to kind of hurry this along. A person can choose to be cremated, especially if they're far away from home or something like that. There can be cremation. It can be simply a person's will, because we live in a time or in a place, particularly in a specific country, where land is running out. I went to Greece several years ago on an island. Well, when you're on a Greek island, there's not a lot of land to buy a plot that you have forever to be buried. Where I was in Greece, they rented land for burial for so many years. But they just didn't have the concept that we have here, that you buy a plot of land and it's yours forever, to be buried in.
Well, I believe isn't the same thing happening like in San Francisco, some of the big cities? It's same thing with the land being kind of landlocked for certain areas. So I had read that somewhere. So I know there's some places even in the United States that's happening as well. Okay, we're going to take that quick pause though. Dr. Carol Houghton is with us. She's the canon lawyer of Diocese of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And we'd love to hear from you, dear listeners. So make sure when a line frees up, you jump in quickly at 1-800-585-9396. We're talking about burial versus cremation. We'll be right back.
And welcome to an EWTN Bookmark Brief. I'm Doug Keck. I just finished interviewing Father William Watson, S.J., about his book, Sacred Story, Affirmations, Meditations on Discernment of Spirits. Father, you want to tell us a little bit about this book?
Yes, Doug. The affirmations, the statements in here are based on Ignatian principles of discernment from weeks 1 and weeks 2 of the exercises. I had taken them out as simple statements in my other book, 40 Weeks in Ignatian Path to Christ, as a beginning for the book to help people to start listening spiritually and in a discernment way to what was going on in their lives. I found that many people liked them so much, I decided to take each statement and put it into a 2-page meditation so that someone who may never pick up a more serious spiritual book could pick this up, read one of these, and find meaning in it in terms of their own spiritual life on a day-to-day basis.
Right, it also says, plus reflections on creation, presence, memory, mercy, and eternity. Again, the book is Sacred Story Affirmations. The author is Father William M. Watson, S.J., available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. Look for the whole interview coming soon to EWTN. And this has been an EWTN Bookmark Brief. Thanks.
This is Bishop John Brungart of the Diocese of Dodge City.
This is Colin Donovan, Vice President for Theology.
This is Father Larry Richards, host of Open Line Thursday. Thanks for listening to EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
So glad you're with us on Take 2 with Jerry and Debbie and our guest, Dr. Carol Houghton. She is Chancellor for the Diocese of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, on the tribunal where she is defender of the bond. She has been there 30 years. She has taught canon law at the seminary level, and we're talking today about burial, the Church's understanding of the dignity of the body, how the body is to be treated post-death, post-mortem, and burial, cremation, and a lot of unique ideas that are out there. In fact, I even got an email from a friend who is listening to the program right now, Debbie and Carol, and he says that millennials nowadays are even talking about what they call green burials, and that is including burying seeds in your cremains so that you can turn into a tree or something like that. So the ideas
creative.
are getting kind of
That's
creative. That's a gentle way to put it, Debbie.
Stretch.
Anyway, let's go to the phones. So we got a lot of people. So if you're on hold, be patient. You will get on the program. Greg called first. He's in Lafayette, Louisiana, listening to EWTN Radio on Christ Our King Radio. Hello, Greg. Welcome to Take 2 with Jerry and Debbie and our guest, Dr. Carol Houghton.
Well, hello.
Hey, Greg.
Yes, sir.
You're on, Greg.
Okay, my question is, what constitutes a burial? For example, let's say I go through the cremation, and my friends take my ashes out on a hiking trail and bury those ashes in the ground. Would that constitute a burial?
Okay, Greg, what the Church requires is that if there's a cremation, then the cremated remains are placed in a durable and worthy container, like an urn. And the funeral directors have these in the funeral homes that people can choose from. And then the urn is what's buried, not just the cremated remains without any container.
Okay, so the container is important. Well, let's carry it a step further. Suppose that urn is taken on this hiking trail and put in the ground. No, just dig a hole and put the urn in there.
Right. So I was going to continue and say, then the burial itself of the urn of this worthy container is to be in consecrated ground. So not just on a private property or, out in the woods or down by the beach or someplace like that, where it could be dug up by an animal or by someone else who's looking for something and disrespected somehow. But it's to be reverenced like a human body would be. And some states have laws that we have to abide by as well when it comes to the burial of bodies or cremated remains. Some states, I believe, in some cemeteries particularly, may have laws regarding vaults as well. That you'd have to check with your own particular cemetery regarding. But there's burial at sea also. I think Debbie mentioned scattering at sea. We don't ever scatter cremated remains because we keep the cremated remains intact as we would a body. But the container itself, like the urn, if it's heavy and durable, worthy container, can be dropped. I believe there may be a hole drilled in it or something like that, and then it's dropped into the sea intact so that the person is actually buried at sea, the cremated remains. That can be done, but there's no scattering of ashes.
So, Dr. Houghton, let me ask you this question because Greg brings up a good point. So, the Catholic Church does permit burial at sea. For under what circumstances?
Burial at sea, the body can be buried at sea intact. The coffin, the casket, if it's a body that's intact, and also, as I understand it, an urn can be dropped intact into the sea, but there's no scattering of cremated remains.
So maybe like if somebody was in the military or something like that?
Yes.
Okay. Well, Greg, thank you so much. You bring up some really good points, and we thank you so much for your contribution to this conversation today. You started it off very well. Hope Dr. Houghton answered some of your questions, and we're going to try to get as many calls in as possible because we have a lot of questions and a lot of comments. So now that Greg freed up that line, if you want to jump in, you got to hurry up, pick up that phone at 1-800-585-9396. We're going to move right along to Maria, listening to EWTN Radio in Tulsa, Oklahoma on Sirius XM 130. Hi, Maria. Welcome to Take Two.
Hi. I have actually two questions. Greg brought up one of the things that's relating to my second question, but my grandmother passed away a few years ago and was cremated, and I was told at the time my mother made the decision, and she's no longer a practicing Catholic, that it was done that way due to the cost. And my husband, and I'd mentioned, being concerned about land use and things like that. I mentioned that I might want to be cremated, and my husband nearly lost his mind. And he's a convert, and he informed me that that is not okay. The Catholic Church is not okay with that. And I'd never heard that before. I'd never heard that. So, but anyway, the question kind of got answered that as long as it's not done in opposition or in defiance of the church, then it's acceptable.
Maria, hang on, and Carol, Dr. Houghton, if you can get that answer ready for Maria. We've got our hard break here right now on Take Two with Jerry and Debbie. Very, very short pause. Maria's laid it out there, and Dr. Houghton will answer that when we come back. 1-800-585-9396 if you'd like to join us.
St. Augustine once wrote, quote, question the beauty of the earth, question the beauty of the sea, question the beauty of the air spread around everywhere, question the beauty of the sky, the sun making the day glorious with its bright beams, the moon tempering the darkness with its shining rays, question the animals that move through the waters and amble about on dry land, question all these things. They all answer you, here we are, look, we're beautiful. Their beauty is their confession. Who made these beautiful, changeable things, if not one who is beautiful and unchangeable? All creation shouts to us that there's a God, and just as a painting gives us a glimpse into the heart of an artist, all creation tells us that God is beautiful. But if we don't take time to question the beauty all around us, we won't hear that. So stop and smell the roses. I mean that literally. God wrote 2 books, Scripture and Creation. We should spend time reading both. This is Chris Stefanik from RealLifeCatholic.com on EWTN Radio.
60 Seconds with Father Mitch Pacwa.
It's not just enough to hear the word and to preach it, but we also have to have an obedience to the word of God. That's also why we have this urgency about doing the things that our Lord says. St. James says, not just hearers of the word, but doers of the word. Not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but those who do all the words that I say. Because he'll otherwise say, go away, I never knew you. Do you want Jesus to say, I don't know you? That's not going to be a happy moment if it happens. You want him to say, I did know you. So every one of us disciples is called personally by name. Jesus does know you, of course, but only if you do his word is it going to be reciprocal.
The people you know and trust are on EWTN.
And we continue along our discussion, burial versus cremation, how the church views this very, very solemn reality, if I can put it that way, one that we all are going to face. We all go out the same door, as I like to say, and if you are planning maybe your end-of-life resting place, get some guidance today from Dr. Carol Houghton, who's a canon lawyer and chancellor for the Diocese of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, or if you have a loved one, a parent, for example. I have both of my parents have died, and so we had to take care of those situations for each of them. So, a very, very important discussion. Maria laid out her question for you, Dr. Houghton. I hope adequately. If not, you can ask for follow-up. But if you understood where Maria was going, feel free to respond.
I think I understood, Melissa, your question. You may want to be cremated. Your husband is not in favor of that, and you didn't know that the church saw cremation now as an acceptable practice, as long as it's not done for reasons contrary to the faith, and that's true. Really, since 1963, the church has permitted allowance was made for cremation, as long as it was not chosen as a sign of denial of Christian teaching, especially that of the resurrection of the dead. And it is acceptable, although the church still strongly recommends burial of the body. So, I mean, it's not, the church is not opposed to cremation in that sense. So it is acceptable. The church still strongly also recommends that the body be brought into the church for the funeral mass, and then cremation follow.
Does that help, Maria?
There was a preference, yes?
No, go ahead.
Yes? Okay, I just never even heard that there was a preference or any sort of, rule about that. So, but my second question is something I've actually always wondered. Now, I know the Catholic Church, years and years past, had a practice of dismembering the bodies of saints. I don't know how to say it. I know, for example, the head and finger that St. Catherine wagged at the Pope is on display separate from the rest of her body, and I just didn't know how to explain it, because I've been asked that, people that I know who aren't Catholic have said, well, Catholics have done weird things, how do you explain this? And my explanation has always been, well, I don't know, but I would guess it has to do more with cultural practices at the time, which is why we don't do that anymore. That I was just curious, how do we talk about that?
Okay, that's a good question, and I think the way I would probably answer that, maybe someone else, another expert, would have a different take on this, but I think I would answer that by saying, the relics of the saints, like St. Catherine of Siena, for example, her head and right thumb are in Siena, but the rest of her body is in Rome. Now, why did they do that? Why would they take that a part of her to Siena, where she was from? I think we can say when someone is declared a saint, and there are miracles surrounding this person, and there's a great veneration that arises for this particular saint, I think it's done for purposes of veneration and for the devout prayers and so on of the faithful who want to pray at the relics of this saint, at this person's grave. But for normal, I don't know how to say this exactly.
No, I think it sounds great, Dr. Carroll. You're doing great.
Normal people, that have not been declared saints, when they are buried, we don't dismember them. We keep the body intact, and we treat cremated remains as we would the body, and we keep those cremated remains intact. And so they're buried in one urn, one vessel, one container. We don't scatter, we don't divide, we don't, divide those ashes in several different locations or places or among relatives or family members, but we respect the integrity of that human person and of that human body. And in our faith of the resurrection of that body, we keep that intact. So I would say the exception is the one that you mentioned, Melissa, that has to do with the saints that we venerate.
Right. And I think you answered it beautifully, Dr. Houghton, and I hope, Maria, that helped with you. To move the faithful along, these saints and the miracles, like you said, Dr. Houghton, I think that does stand outside of the norms of burial. And so, Maria, I hope that helps from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Thanks for listening. And I'm going to keep listening, Maria, because I'm going to ask Dr. Houghton, if I get a chance, a question about people who want to maybe choose cremation so that they don't use up land, if you will. So I'm going to ask that question. So stay listening. Steve, you're up next, but Thomas and Joe, please hang on. We are reading your comments, and we definitely want to get you on the show. So Steve in Palm Beach Gardens, you're up next. Palm Beach Gardens, Florida, listening to EWTN Radio. We're welcome, Steve, to Take Two.
Hi, yes, my name is Steve, and I'm from Palm Beach Gardens, Florida, listening on 98.3, which is a new Christian Catholic station down here. My question has to do with all my family scattered all over in consecrated grounds, burials. I have a piece of property, and I want to start a tradition of being cremated and having a mausoleum built on my property so that my family members, that we have annual retreats there every year. It's so much simpler for everybody to come and honor the dead at this location. Is that permissible in the Catholic Church? I know that we've had family burial sites on farms and stuff forever and ever up north, and I'm just wondering if that's a possibility to have a mausoleum built on my own property, have it consecrated, and then have family members that want to be cremated have their ashes placed in that mausoleum?
Well, that's a really good question, Steve. We haven't talked about mausoleums yet, but certainly mausoleum is in and of itself is an option for the burial, and I use that word in quotes because it's not underground, but it's in a mausoleum above ground. Certainly a good option for cremated remains. I take it this is private property? This would be your own private property?
Ma'am, it is our own private. It's been in our family now for 50 years.
Okay. I think that you would have to run this idea past your own diocesan bishop and see if that area of your property would be blessed and then the mausoleum constructed on it. The problem would be that should your property ever be sold or go to someone else, then what would they do with it? You know, would they maintain it as sacred ground? Because any cemetery, no matter how large or small, that piece of property is considered sacred ground in canon law. It's a sacred place. Just, you know, sacred places can be churches, oratories. Cemeteries are sacred places. And
yes.
So if someone were to buy that piece of property 100 years from now, that area, that piece of land that you designate as a mausoleum is sacred property. It's a sacred place because it houses, you know, the remains of these people, and then what to do with it. You know, say the people who buy it 100 years from now would no longer want a mausoleum on their private property.
How's that, Steve?
That would be the issue to look at.
Okay, and I think we can take care of that with a trust or something of that nature and make sure that that's protected. All right,
okay,
well, thank
but
you.
I'd say the thing to do would be to contact your diocesan bishop and with an attorney start working through that, a canon lawyer and a civil lawyer.
Thank you for the phone call, Steve. Great, interesting question. A lot of interesting questions and comments arising today on Take Two with Jerry and Debbie. Our phone number again is 1-800-585-9396. As Debbie promised, Thomas, you'll be right after Joe in Owensboro, Kentucky, listening to EWTN radio there. Joe, this is Take Two with Jerry and Debbie, and Dr. Carol Houghton will assist you with your question. Hi, Joe.
Hello, everyone. My question has to do with my mom. She died a number of years ago, and she was cremated because of the expense, savings and expense. But at the time, my sisters wanted some of the ashes, and I didn't really at that time know any better, although I can say it didn't feel quite right. I since found out that we shouldn't have done that, and so I even contacted them to see if I could get them back to have them interred with the body or the remains. And one sister informed me that she had sprinkled the ashes in the ocean and the beach. That's where my mom loved. And I was just, I feel like I let her down. And is there something I can do? Is there anything I need to do to make sure that there's no consequences for this?
I'm not sure what you mean by consequences, Joe. At the time, you didn't know that this was not to be done, and so there was no intention there to do anything wrong. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I would, if you did the right thing by asking to have the cremated remains back and to inter them, so that was the right thing to do. And then the one that was taken to the ocean and scattered there was something that you had no control over. That was done and we can't undo that at this point. The only thing you've done, in my judgment, what you could do, and it was the right thing to do, to try to get those remains back and to inter them, which you did. And now, to put your own conscience at ease, I think that that if you haven't spoken to a priest about this, maybe you need to do that, so that you're at peace about this. But other than that, I think, Joe, that you've done all that you can do.
There's
All
still
right, Joe? Yeah, go ahead.
There's still some other remains out there. What should I do with those? There's still another sister has some.
Well, again, I think if you can inter them, they should be interred.
Okay.
But if it's beyond your control, you can talk to your sister about, this is the right thing to do. This is what the church wants us to do. This is what we need to do. This is what we should do. And then, if you can, inter them.
Okay.
That's what the church would ask us to do.
All right. Well, I appreciate your help.
Okay, sure.
Be at peace, Joe. I think Dr. Houghton answered you so beautifully. And also, too, I just wanted to add, Joe, if you have a priest or a deacon that is around you that you feel close to, continue this conversation so you can continue to be at peace. It sounds it sounds like your heart's a little troubled about this, Joe, and it shouldn't be. So, try to get that lifted from you if you can. Okay, Joe?
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Okay. Hey, Dr. Houghton, I have to quickly, I know Thomas, we're going to go to Thomas first. Right after Thomas, I'm going to ask that question. I want to ask you about being landlocked in certain cities, and if the permission is that we can go to other dioceses and purchase plots. I'm going to ask you that after Thomas. Thomas, you've been waiting so patiently. You got our Virtual Patience Award. Thank you. And you're listening on the EWTN app. Welcome to Take Two.
Hello.
Hi, Thomas.
Hi, Thomas.
Yes, I'm just sharing my experience here. I lost my father about 11 years ago due to a horrific suicide that I still to this day can't look at a picture of him. And my mother passed away about 7 months ago, and they both were cremated. I sprinkled my father's ashes over his parents' grave, and my sister passed away about 5 years ago, so my mother wanted her ashes on her grave. And so I dug a hole and put her ashes in there and all that. And I just wanted to share that because I still to this day, I still mourn for my mother. I was praying the rosary at the time when she passed away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure, I know that death is a very difficult thing, Thomas, and it comes sometimes as an unwelcome visitor into our lives, doesn't it? But we have to somehow hang on to our faith that death isn't the end. We have to believe that, eternal life is waiting for all of us, and that death is an interruption of our lives. It's an interruption of our life here, but our life is going to continue with God in eternity. And death is not so much a finality to be feared, but it's the gateway to the fullness of life. And that's what our faith teaches us, and that's what we have to hang on to.
Thomas, I want to jump in and just say, first of all, you have suffered greatly, it sounds like, and I can speak for Debbie, and I'm sure for Dr. Houghton as well. Our hearts are heavy for you as you have described the loss of your father who took his life, your mother passing away. You were there praying the rosary. Your sister, I believe you said, passed away. Thomas, just please know of our prayers, and the church is there for consolation, and we hope that you have sought out some solace from your Christian family, your Catholic Christian family, your parish, your priest. And Thomas, is there anything else that you would like to share, or that we can pray for specifically for you?
Not that I can think of right now.
Okay. Well, please, again, Thomas, know of our prayers, and we have a great family, Debbie, don't we? That people are going to be praying for Thomas in his situation already. Yeah.
Yes, Thomas, we have your back in prayer and your whole entire families. Please know that. We believe in the power of prayer. Thank you for calling in. Dr. Houghton, let me ask you this question real quickly. From these calls that are coming in, death and having experienced a loved one that passes away, that dies, there's all these emotions that happen. There's grief, there's all these things, and then you may have some guilty consciences of I should have, would have, could have done this, and all these feelings that arise. Would you recommend, I think I know what you will say, will you recommend that we continue these conversations, these questions that everybody is asking, we should be asking and having this dialogue with our deacons and our priests that can help us to work through some of these issues and some of these feelings that we're carrying when a loved one dies?
Yes, certainly. And it's actually a good time to start those dialogues before someone dies. So that we know the Church's teaching. And there's some good information out there from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, especially their Committee on Divine Worship. They have a little pamphlet. It's called Reflections on the Body, Cremation, and the Catholic Funeral Rites. There's also another little brochure that's available, Catholic Update from Catholic Update on cremation. Those things are available to read. We can have adult education classes. We can talk individually, one-on-one, with our priests, our deacons, about these issues before they come up and we're in a state of mourning and grief. It's a good time to clarify these things. If we are faithful Catholic Christians and we want to respond as the Church wants us to respond in these times, I think it's a perfect time to address these kinds of issues, even before we're placed into a time of the context of death.
Right. Can I just ask this question real quickly, and then we're going to go right to Anne real fast. Dr. Houghton, if it is true that certain cities are kind of landlocked in some of their cemeteries, I know there's other cities around the United States that have quite a bit of land in their cemeteries, consecrated ground. Is it permissible for us to go to other dioceses and purchase a family plot, if you will, in any are we allowed to do that? Like go to another city and say, hey, we want to be buried in Phoenix, Arizona. Could we do that?
Oh, sure. I believe so, yes. Okay. And also sometimes in these cemeteries that are getting full, instead of land, buying a plot of land, sometimes these cemeteries are now building either a mausoleum or a columbarium for these cremated remains, for the urns. And so instead of going down into the ground, they're building up. And so a columbarium has niches in it for these urns, which contain the cremated remains. And so you'll see these above ground. They're similar to a mausoleum, but they're not just for a particular family. Anyone can purchase a niche, I call it a niche, in these columbariums, and they're specifically made for the cremated remains. And so they hold many urns, and they take up little space in a cemetery, relatively little space, and they're above ground. So some of the cemeteries now, and Catholic cemeteries particularly, are building these columbariums for the cremated remains, and that's perfectly acceptable as a place to, I'm going to say, bury, quote unquote, although it's not underground, these cremated remains.
Very good. Dr. Carol Houghton with us here. We do have time for Ann in South Bend, Indiana, listening to EWTN Radio on Redeemer Radio. But Ann and Dr. Houghton, between the two of you, we got about 90 seconds. So, Ann, if you can be brief, we'd appreciate that. Hello, Ann. Are you there?
Oh, hi. Is this for Ann in South Bend?
Ann in South Bend. Yeah, I got about 30 seconds for your question, please.
Okay, well, I think that the previous callers may have answered. I had the question about someone outside our family had taken some of my dad's ashes, a small amount, to sprinkle them in another cemetery where there was a family member, and so that had concerned me. But I think I've heard the answer, that because we had no knowledge of that, that maybe my conscience can be cleared a little bit on that.
Right, and you didn't know about it at the time. You didn't know that it was wrong at the time, or that it was against church teaching. We can't undo it at this point. The only thing, you know from now on in the future that the church doesn't permit scattering of remains. And certainly I would, pray for your dad, and as you do, I'm sure. And there's not, anything to do to recover those. We pray for him, we commend him, to God, and God's able to resurrect, your dad in the final judgment. We believe that. And by the way, Ann, you're living in South Bend, Indiana, where one of our former bishops is now, Bishop Rhodes.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Ann. Amanda and Marianne, we're so sorry we couldn't get to you. Please go to take2show.com. You have wonderful questions to ask, and we'll be happy to answer those. Dr. Carol Houghton, you are the canon lawyer, and at the Diocese of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. We're so grateful that you're with us. Hope you can be with us again.
Thank you,
Jerry?
Debbie. Thank you.
Thank you, indeed, Dr. Houghton. Tomorrow I will be elsewhere. Debbie, you're going to be by yourself, and the topic is...
if you could be anything
I wish I were
I wish I were a basketball player.
What would you be if you could be anything you wanted? That's tomorrow. Until then, have a beautiful and blessed day.